Thank you for having us. I want to thank Peter Bergen for this book, Manhunt, because this is a book we've all been waiting for. And not just because it's about how we as a nation pursued Osama bin Laden and eventually killed him, but because it tells us so much about the war on terror and how it was conducted at the highest levels. In many ways, this is a culmination of work Peter's been doing for a very long time. If you had to pick both the person who would write about Osama bin Laden's end, and then you would pick Peter Bergen. And if you would pick the next project for Peter, it would have been this book. He's written many books about bin Laden, about al-Qaeda. He's considered the nation's expert on it. So let me get to the heart of this. Why did it take us so long to find bin Laden?
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I know you all have busy lives. And thank you, Karen, for doing this. And thank you, Google, for organizing this. Why did it take so long? You know, Rumsfeld had an interesting answer to that question several years ago when he was asked the same question. He said, in a very Rumsfeldian manner, the world's a big place. Think about how long it took for the Israelis to find Eichmann after the Holocaust, not for a lack of trying. It took 15 years. And in fact, one of the stories I have in the book is the CIA looked at other manhunts, like the hunt for Eichmann, like the hunt for Pablo Escobar, like the hunt for Eric Rudolph, like the hunt for Miram El-Kansi, who killed 2 CIA employees in Virginia in 1993, and they tried to sort of derive any lessons learned. The lesson learned in the Eichmann case is you can hide, but your family may not be as effective at operational security as you are. And in Eichmann's case, his son was dating a girl in Argentina, and he started bragging at their house about something about his father's Nazi past. And the father of the girlfriend called a friend of his in Germany who was a federal judge who was interested in finding former Nazis. Somehow Mossad got wind of that, and they famously kidnapped Eichmann in Buenos Aires and took him back. And of course, he stood trial for his crimes in Jerusalem in 1962 or thereabouts. So, you know, finding bin Laden, on one level, it was kind of a complicated problem. On another level, we spent $500 billion on our national security, just on our intelligence since 9/11. And that was a lot of money to spend to find one person. Because at the end of the day, what was the war on terror? It was really about finding bin Laden in a lot of ways. Because if the Taliban had handed over bin Laden after 9/11, I mean, you wouldn't be in this room because there wouldn't have been a war in Afghanistan. You know, the whole story would have been over.
You know, one of the things that you deftly insert into this book, along with a lot of other things that you might not think are relevant to bin Laden, is the story of 9/11, which is relevant to bin Laden. And you are pretty harsh on the national security establishment, at least some of those people at the top level. You don't name names, but you are concerned about the failures that brought us 9/11. And then you spend a lot of this book talking about the CIA and the CIA's role in taking the wrong direction in trying to find bin Laden and taking so long to find bin Laden. And I'm just wondering on both these things how, after all of these years of thinking about the United States and its relationship to bin Laden and its relationship to al-Qaeda, how you assess the CIA. Are there periods of time in which they're doing a better job than a worse job? And just what your overall report card on them is in the name of the war on terror.
Well, look, I mean, as I think the point of the book wasn't an assessment of like how well the CIA did before 9/11, as you say, but the fact is the CIA did pretty well before 9/11. I mean, 9/11 wasn't an intelligence failure as it was often portrayed. It was a policy failure because the intelligence apparatus of the United States, in particular the CIA, in particular the bin Laden unit, in particular people that Karen knows very well who were in the National Security Council focusing on counterterrorism, Richard Clarke and his deputies, and also, by the way, the FBI field office in New York, which was investigating the first Trade Center attack. I mean, they had their, you know, they were all saying bin Laden's a big problem, and they were also all saying in the summer of 2001, there is an imminent attack. It was the most serious set of warnings I think any administration had ever received about a matter of national security, and it was simply tuned out. And I do say in the book that when President Bush was famously briefed on August 6, 2001 with highly classified presidential daily brief that was titled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States," something we only found out several years later. And I interviewed the woman who wrote that brief, Barbara Sood. She's quoted in the book. You know, after being briefed about that, President Bush took the longest, continued on the longest presidential vacation in 30 years. And so, you know, the idea that, I mean, that's just a fact. So you can draw your own conclusions. Was the Bush administration really concerned about this threat? If they were, why did the president continue on the longest presidential vacation in 3 decades? What happened, of course, is they came into office as if the Cold War wasn't over. Their biggest concerns were China and Russia and anti-ballistic missile defense, which, by the way, doesn't stop anything to, you know, you can't stop a terrorist with an anti-ballistic missile system, a system that doesn't still even work to this day. So, you know, there was plenty of blame to go around, but I think it's at the top levels of the Bush administration from a policy perspective. Now, that said, after the event happened, President Bush presided over the most successful unconventional campaign in modern history, which is in 3 weeks, 300 US Special Forces and 110 CIA officers overthrew the Taliban in 3 weeks. I mean, it was just amazing. And they were victims of their own success because this model was so successful that they didn't get bin Laden at the Battle of Tora Bora because they kept to this model, and that wasn't enough to kind of keep him enclosed at Tora Bora.
Let's talk a little bit about Tora Bora. This is something you've been talking about for 10 years or however long.
Yeah.
And it's always bothered you that we didn't get bin Laden at Tora Bora. When you wrote this book, did you learn anything new?
I did. I mean, there was WikiLeaks is an incredibly useful kind of resource for this kind of reporting because we have there's a lot of material on WikiLeaks which is not significant, but some of it is significant. In particular, the summaries of the Guantanamo interrogations of the detainees there. Karen's written literally several books on this subject. And I have visited Tora Bora where the battle happened on 2 occasions. I've interviewed everybody who was involved, more or less, at a sort of high level. But I still found out things in WikiLeaks which were interesting. There's one particular discovery, which is what did bin Laden do after the Battle of Tora Bora? He disappeared. The kind of conventional view was that he'd gone into Pakistan. Well, in fact, he did something quite clever, which is he doubled back into Afghanistan. He went to a place called Kunar, which is heavily forested, very mountainous, perfect place to avoid American satellites and drones, and he went to ground there for a while. The other thing that I learned, I think a pretty interesting anecdote, on January 4th, 2002, the deputy director of the CIA, the now deputy director of the CIA, Michael Morrell, who was intimate, he's the only person in this book he was with Bush on 9/11. He briefed Bush about the Battle of Tora Bora, and he was the absolutely principal person involved in a lot of the sort of intelligence case in finding bin Laden. So he's the only person who actually spans the whole story. On January 4th, 2002, he went to President Bush and he said, the CIA's official conclusion is that bin Laden was at the Battle of Tora Bora and that he's escaped and he's alive. Now, why is that an interesting anecdote? Well, go back to the campaign of 2004 when John Kerry was making quite an issue of this with George W. Bush in the election campaign, very closely run, very close election campaign. Vice President Cheney publicly said that Kerry was essentially making this fact up, that bin Laden was at the Battle of Tora Bora. George W. Bush made similar comments. General Tommy Franks, who was the sort of Bush supporter and also in charge of the military operations overall, made similar comments. So they all essentially, let's say generously, they forgot what actually happened, or something, you could say something less generous if you were so inclined. Mm-hmm. But I think this is an important point, that the CIA officially briefed President Bush shortly after the battle to tell him it was their conclusion that bin Laden was at the Battle of Tora Bora, that he had escaped. Now, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna change the topic to something else, which is that you referred before to the importance of family or relatives in the capture of Pablo Escobar, in the Eichmann kidnapping. And you make that point early on in a way that keeps a sort of tension through the book, which is, is bin Laden's family going to play a role here? You met bin Laden famously first in 1997. you've been thinking about him for, I don't want to age us, but
a while,
a long time. and you talk a little bit about his family and his family relations and the fact that his wives were with him at Abbottabad, where he was eventually found. And I'm just curious overall how you think about him as a father, as a husband, and just where you place that in his psyche and in the eventual capture.
The CIA was kind of asking a lot of the same questions about, okay, what is the profile of Osama bin Laden? Because most fugitives don't try to take 3 wives and a dozen kids and grandkids around with them for obvious reasons. But they concluded at the agency that it would be quite likely that bin Laden's a family guy. He's had 6 wives, one of whom he had a very brief marriage to, another one who it wasn't even sort of consummated, another one was divorced him, and then he, of course, had 4 wives. And his first wife had left him by the time he got to Abbottabad. So, this is a guy who's been married since he was 17. He was 54. He's got at least 20 kids, probably more like 24 kids now. So the CIA, when they were thinking about what would be the profile of bin Laden, how would he be living, they certainly didn't discount the idea that he'd be with his family. And so when they started zeroing in on the Abbottabad compound, when it became clear that there was not 1, not 2, but 3 families there, and that the 3rd family seemed pretty sizable, to anybody who'd been following bin Laden, that wasn't a sort of, that was actually more of an indication that this is looking pretty good. As a father, he's a doting father. I have a picture in the book with his son Hamza, in which he was reading, poetry to his kids. He was teaching them, played soccer with his kids and volleyball. Hitler was nice to his dogs. I mean, what does that say about anything? Most people are nice to their kids. Is he a misogynist is an interesting question, because certainly his view of the world seems quite misogynistic. And I would say yes, but with a kind of an interesting qualifier, which is that he basically, his first wife went into the marriage with bin Laden. He was 17, she was 15. Obviously, she had no idea that he was going to become an international jihadi, militant. Every other wife along the way who married him understood what he was getting into, because he started being involved in these fights in the Soviet Union, in Afghanistan against the Soviets when he was 22, 23. So he basically said to his wives, if you want to bail out, you can. And in Sudan, one of his wives said to him essentially, I thought I was marrying the son of a billionaire, and now we're living in total poverty in Khartoum without air conditioning, and I'm going back to Saudi Arabia, thank you. Which is what she did. And there was no contest. And so he, by, let's say, Taliban standards, I guess that's relatively, and of course he married wives who with a lot of education. There were 3 wives at the Abbottabad compound. His first 2 wives both had PhDs. They're 62-year-old courier and 54-year-old Shabir. His youngest wife, Amal, the Yemeni, who he was really living with in the Abbottabad compound, she was basically a high school dropout. Maybe, I don't know if she had any schooling at all. But so he's not afraid of educated women.
And she's the one, Amal, who threw herself in front of him as Americans.
Amal she married him when he was 17, and again she was, she was from a rural backwater in Yemen, a place called Ib, and she had told her cousin, I'm going to go down in history, and he was like, well, how are you going to do that? Wow. And the way to do that was to get married to Osama bin Laden, it's interesting to see how these wives, what happens. They now, as you probably know, they're all back in Saudi Arabia, and she'll go back to Yemen. I imagine the Saudis will keep a pretty careful watch over the 2 older wives, but in Yemen it's kind of a inefficient police state, so she might have some ability to communicate.
Let's talk about the courier a little bit. The United States intelligence agencies and defense establishment seems to have known about the courier since December 2003, January 2004, and his role in top-level al-Qaeda operations.
Yeah.
Then it took us until a year ago today to actually tie the courier to bin Laden and kill bin Laden. How do you account for that? And let's put on hold talking about how we got the information, because I think that might be another...
Well, why it took so long, everybody knows who Whitey Bulger is? Whitey Bulger killed 20 people in Boston and was on the FBI's most wanted list starting in 1999. The allegation is he killed 20 people. He was found relatively recently, I think, in Santa Barbara, living quietly by the sea. And the FBI has tried to be, it's not an incompetent organization by any stretch. So, if your people are not, see, the problem about finding bin Laden was the United States has a few ways to find you. Signals intelligence, you're talking on your cell phone. That's how they found Pablo Escobar. Essentially, they gave the Colombian police directional finding technology that allowed them to zero in on his cell phone. Well, it was a radio phone at that time. Another way is human intelligence, and we don't have a huge number of Taliban fundamentalist Pashtun speakers who can pass for members of al-Qaeda that would be able to penetrate the group. And that's what would have been required. Another way is people drop a dime on you to pick up a reward. That happened, for instance, in Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11. Somebody picked up $25 million. Well, when people in bin Laden's immediate circle think he's basically the savior of true Islam, they're not going to drop a dime on him. And then, people make mistakes, and that's the other way you find people. But, waiting for bin Laden to make a mistake was obviously not a particularly effective strategy.
But one of the things that your book conveys, that part of it was about bin Laden, that maybe he wasn't directing operational activities around the world, but that he understood, he was very careful. I mean, you were at Abbottabad. You got in there before the Pakistanis destroyed the compound. Talk a little bit about how he protected himself and how he was aware of all of these ways that he could have begotten at.
Well, he stopped using a cell phone. Cell phones were not in existence in Afghanistan at the time. He stopped using a satellite phone probably in '98. He was very paranoid about, I met him in '97, and we were treated in an extremely paranoid, secretive, disciplined way, searched very thoroughly, not allowed to carry anything with us except not even a watch. They were very concerned about electronic tracking devices, for instance. So, he wasn't letting people in his immediate circle who, that he didn't know very well. He wasn't talking on a cell phone. He wasn't sort of, obviously using the internet. And
you talk about his house and the windows in his house, how he had this house constructed for himself in Abbottabad, and how the windows were these slits so that you actually couldn't see.
In a way, he became a prisoner. He created his own prison. It meant that it was very hard to find him, but also when the night came, the SEALs were there, he couldn't really see very much because he'd created this almost like this prison-like environment. But at the end of the day, he faced a dilemma, which was he could essentially stop communicating with anybody and never be found, or he would have to remain in communication with some of his followers, and there would be some possibility of finding him. So the agency, essentially, I say in the book, a female analyst, and one of the interesting side stories here is how the CIA, one of the biggest cultural shift, I quote somebody in the book, in the CIA in the last 20 years is the rise of women in the agency. And the bin Laden unit was full of women initially because at that time, before 9/11, it was seen as a kind of backwater and no one really cared about bin Laden. But some of the people who did the work that found him in particular were women, and there was a particular female analyst who essentially said in 2005, when it was clear there was going to be no magic bullet, there are going to be 4 ways we can find him. We can either find him through his immediate family and their communications with him, and that never really happened. We can find him through the communications that he makes to Al Jazeera and other media outlets, and those were always dry holes, as it turned out. We can find him with communications with the senior leadership, and that didn't really bear much fruit. Or we can find him through a courier. And I think deductive logic showed quite early on that that was the way to go. But see, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, which is the name of the courier, that's equivalent of being, the father of Ahmed the Kuwaiti. I don't know what the number of citizens of Kuwait are, but it's not an insignificant number. And of course, he's not even really Kuwaiti. He was really a Pakistani whose family had gone to Kuwait and they moved back. And Pakistan is twice the size of California with a population of 180 million people. So trying to find out, in terms of the leaping over the question of coercive interrogation for a minute, the things that really got to find Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti was associating a real name with him, which took till 2007. The next big break was associating a cell phone with this real name. That took till June of 2010. And the reason that happened is they switched cell phone carrier or did something to the way they communicated on cell phone that it made it a lot easier for the National Security Agency of the NSA to geolocate the phone. But even when you geolocated the phone, it still took a while to find where this guy lived because he was very careful. He took the battery and he switched off his phone and took the battery out at least an hour's drive from where he lived. So then it was a matter of inserting, human spies on the ground to actually survey this guy and follow his distinctive white Jeep back to where he lived in Abbottabad. And there was no expectation that he'd be living with bin Laden. The CIA thought there would be a whole other sort of set of hoops to jump through. But as they started looking at this compound, the strange third family, then they were beginning to think, well, maybe bin Laden's there.
Let's talk very briefly, I promise, about enhanced interrogation techniques. Al-Qaeda is one of the individuals that we've known for a long time was tortured or to whom enhanced interrogation techniques were applied in December of 2003 and January of 2004. And those techniques were approved by Donald Rumsfeld. And we've always had this question lingering in this question of torture of whether or not you can get reliable evidence. One of the things seems to be that from Qaeda, as your book says, we did get information. And could you talk a little bit about what that information was, and then we'll talk a little bit about, so we know how important.
Yeah, well, Qaeda is really an interesting case because he appears, from what we can tell, to be the first person who to finger Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti as a sort of reasonably significant player in al-Qaeda. He describes him as somebody who was giving him instruction. Al-Qaeda was going to be the 20th hijacker and was arrested at Orlando, well, not arrested, turned back at Orlando Airport by a very astute INS officer who said, this guy's on a one-way ticket, doesn't really speak English, and Qaeda became hostile. A year later, he was picked up in Pakistan. His cover story, as was not infrequent in these cases, was that he'd gone to Afghanistan because of his pressing interest in falconry when he was in Guantanamo. Now, eventually they matched this guy to the fingerprints of the hostile guy in Orlando, who many people think is the 20th hijacker because Mohammed Atta was waiting for him outside the airport. So now this guy, the 20th hijacker, says that he was trained in sort of internet, kind of the use of the internet and other things by the KSM, the operational commander of 9/11. So that means he's sort of, that Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti is playing an important role in al-Qaeda. Now, did that happen before the coercive interrogation? Did it happen after? Did it happen during? We don't know. But WikiLeaks and other ways of, we know how this guy was treated. And when Karen uses the word torture, which I think is a word that can sometimes be, as it were, abused, in this case, Susan Crawford, who's a federal prosecutor appointed by the George W. Bush administration to oversee the Guantanamo trials, who was appointed to the bench by Ronald Reagan, so not a sort of pinko liberal by any stretch, said this guy Qaeda could never be tried for anything because he'd been tortured. So Qaeda was undoubtedly coercively interrogated. He undoubtedly gave up useful information. The Senate Intelligence Committee is doing a massive investigation of all this, and Dianne Feinstein last night released a kind of a press release giving some of the early indicators of what they're going to come up with. It's going to be a 5,000-page report. They looked at several million pages of documents, and it will be the definitive history of what really happened in this program. And neither of us on this stage know enough about it to really say exactly what happened. But Qaeda gave up interesting information. He was coercively interrogated. Somebody else seems to have given up useful information. We know less about him. He was picked up in Iraq. And then the flip side is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his replacement Abu Faraj al-Libi, the number 3 in al-Qaeda, were both coercively interrogated. And they gave disinformation about Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, the courier. So where does that leave you? I mean, we can't run history backward. And there is ammunition sort of for both sides of the argument, I think. But the fact is that the first big break in the 9/11 case came from a guy called Abu Zubaydah, who was interrogated with completely conventional techniques by the FBI by a guy called Ali Soufan, who was a well-known Arabic-speaking FBI agent. And he gave up within about a week the key information about the operational commander of 9/11. So, and there are many examples of this. Somebody I quote in the book, Brad Garrett, is an FBI agent who interrogated Ramzi Youssef on the flight back from Pakistan. He was the architect of the first Trade Center attack. Ramzi Youssef gave up the whole story in the course of a plane flight.
I was really impressed by the way that you didn't back away from the topic and handled it in a very even-keeled and I thought responsible way. And I thought, no, I'm not sure anybody else could have done it as well.
I went into it thinking the answer was likely to be kind of gray, like a lot of things in life. And the answer is, it is kind of gray. It's not, it's not one of these perfect sort of, well, one group was wrong and one group is right.
Right. And it doesn't affect the moral question of whether it's right or not. The question of, or does it affect
That's an
the moral?
interesting question. I mean, that's like at a level above my pay grade.
Right, I know. I didn't expect you to make that comment. I want to turn to a different subject. One of the things that surprised me about the book was how much of it is after 2008. It's almost like we're trying, we're sort of trying, we don't know what we're doing, and then all of a sudden, 2007, late.
I think that's right, and I think, the President Bush, I quote Mike Hayden, then the director of the CIA, every morning he would go into the Oval Office at Thursday at 8 a.m. for his weekly meeting with the President, and President Bush, the first question was, how's it going, Mike? And everybody in the room understood that to mean, how is finding bin Laden going? I mean, President Bush didn't, he wanted to find bin Laden. And I think General Hayden came to Bush in 2007 and said, we haven't killed a single person in a drone strike this year. Al-Qaeda is regrouping. Bear in mind that in 2005 we had the biggest terrorist attack Al-Qaeda had done in the West since 9/11, which was the 7/7 attacks in London. Bear in mind that in the summer of 2006 there was a plan to bring down 7 American, Canadian, British airliners over the Atlantic. If it had succeeded, 1,500 people dead, a 9/11 style event. So Al-Qaeda was regrouping in the tribal regions. Musharraf didn't seem to be doing enough about it. And so the agency essentially came to the president with a plan to basically amp things up, amp up the drone strikes, and they're preaching to the choir. And I think there was also an attempt in the last 6 months of President Bush's presidency to try and eliminate as many members of al-Qaeda as possible with drone strikes, and they were quite successful. In the first 6 months of in the last 12 months of President Bush's presidency, there were 6 drone strikes in the first 6 months, and there were 44 in the last 6 months. Yeah. And so this program got dramatically amped up. Now, what's a little surprising is President Obama comes in, maybe surprising for the people who voted for him. He amped it up and quintupled it. I mean, he didn't just take the program and say, hey, we're just going to keep going. He quintupled the number of drone strikes. He tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan. He was extremely aggressive, and I had an op-ed in the Times on Sunday in which I called him the warrior in chief, because I think there's a certain amount of cognitive dissonance both on the right and the left about who President Obama is as a commander in chief, which is, he won the Nobel Peace Prize very early in his presidency. He used that as an opportunity to say, much as I admire Gandhi and Martin Luther King, nonviolence wouldn't have stopped the Nazis, and you can't negotiate with al-Qaeda. I'm paraphrasing. And so he's been and remember in the campaign, he was roundly criticized for the idea that he would do a unilateral strike into Pakistan if the Pakistanis wouldn't work. Romney called him a Dr. Strangelove. McCain said, we're going to bomb one of our allies. And Hillary Clinton said that he was telegraphing the wrong message or something to that effect. So the point is that if people had actually been paying attention to what he sort of said, both in his campaign and also in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, which most people would use as an opportunity not to discuss their philosophy of war, maybe there'd be less cognitive dissonance. And I think the left has said very little, really. I mean, this is the first American president in history that I'm aware of who's actually authorized the assassination of an American citizen. And by the way, has also killed an American teenager, because Anwar al-Awlaki's son was also killed in a drone strike unintentionally, but nonetheless, it's the case. And then on the right, he can't, he's not going to get any credit for, or very little credit, or very begrudging credit for what he's really done.
Now, I think that's a really important point about President Obama's willingness to be a warrior. And
I think what I say in the piece in the Times was, and I didn't actually fully develop this, but this is the first major American political figure, when I say major, really major, who, in a sense, other than somebody like Hillary Clinton, who isn't sort of, who for Vietnam the issue is not what happened in Vietnam. If you think about, for McCain and Kerry, their service in Vietnam is sort of in a sense what defined them as people for so long. For Cheney, who took 5 deferments, as we know, his lack of service in Vietnam is certainly part of his story. President Bush, of course, was in the Texas National Guard. He didn't serve in Vietnam. Bill Clinton was at Oxford and then got a, sort of at the end, his number wasn't called. So Obama is part of a generation of Democrats for whom Vietnam is not an issue, and I think that maybe, this is complete speculation, is he prepared to use violence in a way that isn't so hobbled by the kind of question of Vietnam? If you go back to the discussions of the Afghan surge, Dick Holbrooke, who was the Afghan-Pakistan representative of Obama to the region, served in Vietnam. Joe Biden, of course, was sort of out of that generation, and they were concerned that tripling the number of troops in Afghanistan would be a Lyndon Johnson-like decision. Anyway, so Obama doesn't seem to be that preoccupied by it, and I think this says a lot about the way he makes decisions. He doesn't make decisions from the gut at all. You recall how he was criticized for tripling the number of troops in Afghanistan, taking 10 weeks to sort of discuss it. I'm like, 10 weeks? I mean, I've been visiting Afghanistan since 1993. It's pretty complicated just to understand the basics about it. Look at the deliberative process in this case, and of trying to find, Osama bin Laden. August 2010 is when it became clear that there was a real possibility. It took almost a year. So he pulls the trigger, but he's not trigger happy, and it's deliberative, and it's also in a very kind of structured process within the National Security Council. I think that look at his intervention in Libya, by the way, which was, it took 2 years for Clinton to intervene in Bosnia. He never intervened in Rwanda. So there seems to be just a different kind of presidency in terms of that issue, and I think it's a little unexpected.
He is the decider, actually.
Indeed. Well, that's what really this is a really interesting thing about the book, is that our system, I quote Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor, at the end of the day, somebody has to go into their own bedroom at night and make a decision on behalf of 300 million Americans. And that's a pretty lonely place to be. And if you think about the decision that the President made, you have Vice President Biden saying you shouldn't do this. Now, Vice President Biden became a senator when Obama was age 10. You have Secretary Gates saying you shouldn't do this, you should do something else. Secretary Gates joined the Nixon administration as a official when Obama, I think, was 13. I may have my numbers slightly wrong, but the point is that these very senior guys with incredible, Gates has served every president since Nixon, and was in the room when Operation Eagle Claw, the ill-fated Iranian rescue operation, blew apart. I mean, he was in the White House as a 41-year-old. Relatively senior CIA. He was the executive assistant to the CIA director at the time, Stansfield Turner. He saw the whole thing unfold in real time. I mean, that was very much on his mind. And then, the number 2 military officer in the nation, James Cartwright, was advocating another course. So to make a decision like that, Hillary Clinton was saying go for the raid after she gave a very loyally deliberative presentation. And I did an interview with her in which I quote her directly, and she says, I gave a long and sort of deliberative presentation because President Obama that's what's going to convince him.
Loyally.
She really examined the pros and cons, and people didn't know where she was going to go. In the end, she said, you should do the raid. Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA, was, of course, pushing for the raid from the beginning. And he also had a sort of a form of a political argument, which is, I quote him again directly from an interview, he said, Mr. President, this is the test I would use. What if an ordinary American was in the room? And what if they knew, what we know? What would they say about it? And I think the answer to that is, I think most Americans would say, yeah, I mean, this is worth the risk. And then there was a sort of another form of a political argument, which is, you want to do this when there's no moon. Well, the lunar cycle is, of course, a month, and the next no moon weekend was going to be June 1st. By now, even though this was incredibly tightly held for so long, meetings that would have meant, in the White House, people began to notice there were a set of meetings which were called non-meetings. I don't know if you have those at Google, but so the non-meetings, very few people were coming to them. or allowed to come to them, and no seconds. Nobody was allowed to just sort of substitute. There was no paper trail. There was no written products. But at a certain point, when you do an operation like what happened in Abbottabad, you are going to have to bring in more people. And even if they're not fully briefed on what's happening, the universe of people is growing. And as it grows exponentially. So, what happened if somebody started blogging about this, or just, it leaked out, bin Laden wouldn't have hung around. And the political costs also of not doing something were actually pretty high, because, if you hadn't done the raid and then 2 months later it had come out that we had all this information, it would have been a disaster. So it was a very tough decision.
Right, and as you point out, even then, even with all of the pressure on him, he took the night to think about it, right?
I would love to have been, I asked for an interview with him and didn't get one. He did do a pretty substantial interview with 60 Minutes, and then he gave a very interesting interview to the History Channel in which he kind of developed some of his thoughts further. And obviously I was able to talk to a lot of people familiar with his decision making, but at the end of the day it was his decision, it was nobody else's. So the idea that anybody could have made this decision, which I've heard in the last day or two, I think that is absolutely nonsensical. I mean, let's do the thought experiment where Joe Biden was a Democrat candidate for president who seemed to have a lot more foreign policy experience. By his own admission, he wouldn't have made the same choice, and we know he wouldn't have made the same choice. Do the thought experiment where Bob Gates was president. So the point is not everybody would have made the same decision. It's very easy to say retroactively, because it worked out pretty well, that that's the decision I would have made. Not at all clear to the people involved.
It's very interesting. I mean, you've sort of laid out the answer to the question I wanted to ask you, which one of the very interesting things is I expected, even though I know you, I expected there to be a lot in this book about the SEAL team and how they thought, sort of that kind of book. And it's very much not that. This is a
They
book,
wouldn't talk to me, so that's really
well,
easy.
Okay. Well, but it's very much about the teamwork that went on inside the Obama administration. And for a president who has made his mark being the deliberative, procedural, process-driven, as Hillary Clinton says, lawyerly type. He actually did this in that way. And you watch this last year come together of one opinion after another. It's a little bit surprising, the absence of Gates in the narrative. But it's also surprising, not because of his position, just because it surprised me in the narrative, the prominence of Panetta. If there's a hero in this book, in some ways, although there are a lot of people who could be heroes, and you could make the case for the president and for that particular woman at the CIA. Do you
think Al Pacino will play him? Or,
I don't know. I think it's we have to think. But it's very interesting how he's the person who goes in and says, Abbottabad, why don't we know more about it? We need to know more about it.
Panetta was just very incensed by. I mean, he was getting, very angry about why they weren't able to get more information about. He's certainly one of the people who comes out of the book incredibly well. I mean, there's a great quote from him in the book. I interviewed him, one of the last people to interview, and the morning of the raid, he looks at himself in the mirror, and he's shaving, and he says, "The next time I look at myself in the mirror, this is either going to go pretty well, or I'm going to have a lot of explaining to do to a lot of people." So the point is, no. And another great quote, he was talking to his deputy, Mike Morrell, who I mentioned earlier. They had a final conversation before the raid, and Mike Morrell says, "Where are you, Director Panetta, on this?" And he says, either one of them or both of them say versions of, either bin Laden is not going to be there, or he is going to be there. And they both say that's where we both are. I mean, these are the two most senior intelligence officials in the United States, in a sense. Both. I think Panetta comes out of it very well. Admiral McCraven, who organized the raid, comes out of it very well. A lot of people come out of it well. It wasn't my intention to make them look good. I mean,
no, it's not. It's that they look good they work as a team from all different parts. If you ridicule the interagency process, this would be one instance where
I think this will be one of these things like the Cuban Missile Crisis that historians will be examining as a sort of classic case study of presidential decision making. Already, Graham Allison, who wrote the best book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, did a piece in Time last week, sort of looking at this sort of in a very sort of analytical frame, and. It worked, but it could have, if things had gone wrong, it might be one of those presidential case studies of Operation Eagle Claw, which was a total,
disaster. Let's talk a little bit about bin Laden. and bin Ladenism.
Yeah.
One of the things, he's referred to by surveillance teams as the pacer. They realize there's somebody pacing back and forth in the compound. They're not sure who it is, but so they name him the pacer. It turns out to be bin Laden. There are certain things that happen that surprise us about bin Laden, and one of them is the Arab Spring and the fact that he can't, for all of the complaining that he'd done and pointing to mistreatment of Muslims and this war between the religions and this war on Islam, when it actually comes right down to it, what happens in those final years of bin Laden's life is that the headline is not about al-Qaeda. Talk a little bit about what you think this meant to bin Laden and what it means for the future of al-Qaeda in general.
Well, I think we know what it meant to bin Laden. I mean, bin Laden released around 30 audio tapes and videotapes after 9/11, and he would comment on the matters of the most minor interest in the Muslim world, arcane discussions of theology amongst Saudi clerics. He would talk about the decision in France to ban the public wearing of the burqa. He would talk about any issue of any significance to Muslims anywhere. The floods in Pakistan of the summer of 2010, the list goes on and on. He never released a tape about the Arab Spring. He did make one which has been recovered, but this is the most significant event in the Middle East since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in at the end of World War I. And yet he had nothing to say about it. And I think there's a reason for that. His people were not involved, his ideas were absent. I didn't see to me it was very telling that in the thousands of hours of videotape of the Arab Spring, there was not one picture of an American flag being burned. There wasn't even a picture of an Israeli flag being burnt, because these issues, which had seemed to so animate the Middle East, actually were not the real issues. The real issues were the mistreatment of Arab publics by their rulers and authoritarian kleptocracies, often family kleptocracies. And people had enough. Of course, in Egypt, the main political party was called Kafir, which just simply means enough. They had people that had enough. And this was nothing to do with bin Laden. Bin Laden, was losing the war of ideas in the Muslim world long before the Arab Spring or his own death, because he had nothing to offer. I mean, there's no al-Qaeda hospital system or social welfare service or ideas about political economy. It's just a restoration of the caliphate, by which he means not the Ottoman Empire, but Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco. And most Muslims see what the Taliban did in Afghanistan. It's not a very attractive model for the future. So, bin Laden was on the wrong side. I mean, the two great quotes that I use at the end of the book, one is by President Bush, who 9 days after 9/11 said that al-Qaeda would eventually join the unmarked grave of discarded lies, just as fascism and communism had. And President Obama called them small men on the wrong side of history. And those are both accurate. And bin Laden, one of the really interesting things to me about bin Laden's death was the absence of reaction to it in the Arab and Muslim world writ large. You can have a 1 million man march in Pakistan over almost nothing. And there was nobody getting out on the streets. There was the usual sort of 100 rent a crowd type, religious fanatics in Quetta and places, but there was nothing significant. So, bin Laden moment had long come and passed. I mean, I think when we zoom out and look at this in a sort of historical sense, we're going to look at this as a period of essentially, world domination by Google and uninterrupted peace. And 9/11 will be seen as a sort of a significant event, but it was an aberrational event. And I think we can say that now already. I mean, I don't think al-Qaeda doesn't pose a national security problem in the United States or anything close. Since 9/11, 17 Americans have died in the United States as a result of al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda-like individuals or groups. More Americans die accidentally in their bathtubs every year, something like 300 every year. We don't have an irrational fear of accidental bathtub drowning, so we shouldn't have an irrational fear of al-Qaeda. In fact, we're doing their business for them if we do. So, let's put it all in perspective. We had a case today, by the way, in Cleveland, where a group of anarchists were planning supposedly to try and blow up a bridge. So it's not the only, al-Qaeda and jihadi militants, it's not the only form of terrorism out there, but we have a huge, on 9/11 there were 16 people on no-fly list, now there are 21,000. On 9/11 there was no TSA. We can debate about the merits or demerits of that, but the point is there was none. On 9/11 there was no DHS. On 9/11 the FBI and the CIA were barely talking. On 9/11 there were very few joint terrorism task forces. We have directed the United States a huge amount of resources and thinking about this problem, and it is basically, no politician's going to get up and say the problem is over, because what if it isn't? Even if you're wrong by 1%, politically you'd pay a huge price. But we can say, you know, this problem, I mean, I have every interest in sort of saying this is a problem that continues to exist because I've spent 15 years and 4 books trying to document it, but I feel like a Sovietologist in 1989, which is like, this problem is, the difference is, of course, the Soviet Union officially dissolved itself. Al-Qaeda will never say, hey, we are out of business, but they are effectively out of business. If the death of bin Laden, the Arab Spring, isn't the punctuation mark, I mean, what is? And we didn't kill every Nazi to win the World War II.
Well, perhaps you could whisper that into the ear of some politician, and maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I could whisper it, but I think it would be a waste of breath because I think politicians are politicians because they want, you know, this is not even a criticism of them. They're not going to say that because it comes freighted with too much political cost if you're wrong.
Well, let me ask you a question. Do you think that there is a concerted group of politicians who think that the al-Qaeda moment is over and the threat of al-Qaeda is something we can now be at ease about?
The way I would answer that, at Christmas Day 2009, if that plane had blown up over Detroit with 300 Americans on board, carried live on CNN, the president, you know, the Obama presidency would have been over, in my view. He would be a one-term president. And that's not a comment on him, or it's a comment on the zero tolerance that the American people now have for this kind of thing. After all, Pan Am 103 blew up over Scotland, killing 270 people in 1988. It wasn't the end of George H.W. Bush's presidency. But in the post 9/11 era, you know, that would be just something that would be politically impossible to recover from. So
we need to keep this, or we will keep this big infrastructure. Do we need all of that to make sure?
Oh, I mean, I'm sure we don't. There are 860,000 Americans with top secret clearances, not secret, top secret. I mean, I don't think they all need them somehow. And you know, having a certain amount of redundancy is fine, but you know, there's clearly everybody's going to have to give blood at the blood bank in terms of this budget crisis, and the national security industrial complex shouldn't, you know, be exempted.
Well said. Do you have any questions? I have a few minutes for questions if you have any. Go to the microphone if you have a question.
I actually have a question.
Good.
I actually have 2 questions, but I'll make them brief. First one is I read your piece in the New York Times, the op-ed piece, which I thought was excellent. But a few days later, and I don't know if you caught it in a Wall Street Journal, there was a piece that, and I can't remember who wrote it, that sort of implied that the Obama administration is losing their focus on al-Qaeda and focusing more on China and the Far East. And I was just wondering what your reaction to that is. And the second thing, on a more personal level, I realize you're a journalist, and there's always a tension between journalism and the national security apparatus. But I was just wondering, are there ever times where you're surprised by what information is publicly available, where you say to yourself, wow, I didn't realize that, or, you know, that might be information that could help al-Qaeda or some other terrorist organization?
Good.
Well, on the question of, you know, information that's publicly available, obviously, I'm a journalist, so I'm in favor of as much publicly available information, and obviously with at Google, which is, you know, obviously that's part of Google's philosophy. Am I surprised what's out there? The way I would answer that is, you know, the CIA belatedly, but in a real way, is getting into the open source intelligence business, which, you know, when I've been writing about bin Laden, some of the most useful materials were stuff that was publicly available information in the Arab language press. And the open source, universities have access to it. It's a CIA-funded thing, and universities and think tanks, and that's a tremendous resource. So I mean, I'm happily surprised by so much is available. And I think that until recently, I think the intelligence community tended to view things that weren't secret as not being useful. I think they now understand that in fact most of the useful material is actually open. At the end of the day, there are certain things that are. There's a distinction between secrets and mysteries, and mysteries are very hard to, and it doesn't matter. You know, a mystery might be, what is Ahmadinejad really thinking, and that's a tough one, and obviously not something easily available in open source. On the question of China, like the idea that the United States government can't chew gum and sort of walk simultaneously is ridiculous. I mean, al-Qaeda has received a huge amount of attention. And it's, I think it's good that there's been more attention on these other issues. They're not going away. So I just don't buy that.
We're here.
I have two questions. The first is, you said if they had handed over bin Laden, there would be no war on terror. Do you truly believe that? Like, isn't it a little bit pretext? Like,
Okay, and next question.
so as someone who served in Afghanistan, what is the future for the country?
Thank you.
Okay, well, what's the future of Afghanistan? I mean, unlike a lot of people, I'm somewhat optimistic. I've been visiting since '93. I was there in the Civil War. I was there under the Taliban. You know, what's happening in Afghanistan is not great. On the other hand, it's much better than being invaded by the Soviets, having a civil war, and being ruled over by the Taliban, which is what happened to the country in the last 30 years. There was no phone system under the Taliban. There's now 1 in 3 people in Afghanistan has a cell phone. There were no girls in school now. 2 million girls are in school. GDP growth rate was like 20% in 2009. I mean, the list goes on and on. There have been advances. So I mean, not to say that Afghanistan will be anything other than a not particularly successful, Central Asian state like Tajikistan. I mean, that's kind of what it will be. But I think the prognosis is really reasonably good. We signed an agreement with the Afghan government in principle that the United States will be there for another 10 years after 2014. And I think most Afghans are happy about that, that we will continue to be involved in the future of their country. The pretext on bin Laden, no, I mean, I think if the Taliban had handed over bin Laden, why would we have gone to war with them? I mean, it's not like Afghanistan is such a valuable piece of territory for the United States. There would be no reason to, why, I mean, let's do the thought experiment, they handed over bin Laden. The United States would still have gone to war to fight the Taliban, you think?
Iraq?
I don't see the connection. I mean,
Let's move on to another question.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to sum up. Like, I talked to a lot of Afghans.
You know what? We're just going to take the next question. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Hi. I have a related question to that, which is, as the person who manages for Google our military veteran programs internally and externally, we've seen our military and our American public has seen the goal shift a number of times. At least that's the perspective of the hundreds of veterans that I've talked to who have served on multiple deployments. And so we went in to get bin Laden. We decimated al-Qaeda. Bin Laden is gone. Now it's all about the Taliban. We're going to be there for 10 years. As from your perspective of having written so many books and covered this winding road of this story over the many years, where does the goal stop? And when we do leave in 10 years, what's to say that the Taliban isn't going to come back? So I know, I mean, there's sort of
right. No, I mean, that's a
question,
fair enough question. I mean, I think, why are we in Afghanistan? What is the strategy? And I think if, President Obama was here, or President Romney, if he gets elected, or President Hillary Clinton or any other president would say that we're in Afghanistan basically to prevent the Taliban having a resurgence of any meaningful nature. Not to say that the Taliban won't be part of the future of Afghanistan in some way, but it wasn't just al-Qaeda that was living in Afghanistan pre-9/11. Every sort of jihadi group from the Philippines to Uzbekistan to around the world was living there. And the reason that it's a kind of powerful argument to sort of say we should trying to continue this counter-sanctuary strategy is we've tried for varieties of ways in the past to, we've had an Afghan policy of essentially leaving it. So in 1989, we closed our embassy, and we zeroed out aid to the poorest country in the world at the time. That was under the Clinton administration. And George H.W. Bush closed the embassy there, his administration. And into that vacuum came, the civil war, the Taliban. And then we did a version of that again in 2002 when George W. Bush, because of an ideological aversion to nation building, didn't really do anything in Afghanistan. In 2003, there were 6,000 American soldiers in Afghanistan. It's a country the size of Texas with a population 10 times the size of Houston, and 6,000 is the number of policemen in Houston. So it was not enough to kind of maintain control. And so I think any American president will say, we'll try and maintain some kind of presence. Now, in our post-2014 presence is not going to be a combat presence. It's going to be an advisory presence because the Afghan National Army is going to need help. And by the way, we went, the coalition in Iraq was essentially, the British, and that was that. The coalition in Afghanistan includes about 40 countries, including some Muslim countries. Jordan and Qatar have very small contingents. And many countries are threatened by, the Germans are threatened. There's a case going on right now in Germany today about some Germans who are training in the tribal regions who are planning to attack in Europe. So I think that is I don't think it's so much the goalposts have changed. So part of it is also like what people say about what the strategy is. And I think that it's easier just to say we're there to defeat al-Qaeda rather than to say our goal is a counter-sanctuary strategy to prevent the Taliban coming back from controlling even a significant part of the country where they might bring back al-Qaeda and like-minded groups, because that does not fit very well on a bumper sticker, but that's really the strategy.
Take the last question.
So based on your research, do you believe there was ever any sincere attempt or intention to capture bin Laden alive? Or was this team effectively on a shoot-to-kill mission? And if we had brought him out alive, what would have happened?
Well, I say in the book, I mean, there was a plan if we captured bin Laden to take him to Bagram Air Force Base and then put him on a plane to the USS Carl Vinson, which is a huge warship, which is where he was buried, essentially, from that warship. And there was a group of high-value interrogators, a special high-value interrogation team, linguists, lawyers, experts in al-Qaeda who were assembled there, who would have interrogated him in Bagram and then on the Vinson, and he probably would have been kept there for several months, probably incommunicado. It would not have been announced if it was a way to kind of keep it covert that he was actually in custody. Was there any real chance that he was going to be killed, captured? I'm pretty skeptical. First of all, his own public statements were, I'm going to go out as a martyr, and he'd said that repeatedly. Secondly, unless he conspicuously surrendered, I think the rules of engagement suggested that adult males in the building were likely to be killed, which is what happened. And the U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 is not the Red Cross. On the other hand, they do have rules of engagement which they would follow. But he didn't conspicuously surrender, and he was shot. Why he didn't put up a fight is a question that I could never really kind of get a good answer to, because obviously he wasn't available for an interview.
Let me ask you one final question, Peter, following up on that. Was there anything that you in particular would have liked to know from bin Laden had he been taken alive, that beyond what we've gotten from the documents cache that has been retrieved from the Abbottabad house? Is there anything we wanted to know?
Well, one of the interesting things about these documents is a question that I've always had about bin Laden, which is, he claims he's a defender of Muslims, yet a lot of his victims have been Muslim civilians, and a lot of his victims have been civilians. And from a sort of juridical Islamic theology perspective, that's not a very easy thing to say is okay. And plenty of people have pointed out that bin Laden is on very thin ice when he says it's okay to kill American civilians and others. So a question I would have had for him is, how did he justify that? He's been asked that. But what's interesting in these documents is it became clear to bin Laden that sort of the attacks that people were doing on civilians in al-Qaeda's name were actually very counterproductive. I have a piece on CNN right now. The leaders of al-Qaeda wrote the Pakistani Taliban saying, you've got to desist from these attacks on mosques and public marketplaces that are killing lots of Pakistani civilians. Now, was that a tactical thing? Was that a religious thing? Was it both? Probably a little bit of both. But the al-Qaeda itself was beginning to realize that this was its main Achilles heel.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you, Peter. And I encourage you to buy the book, which is for sale over there, and it's wonderful.